Hello, my name is Tony. When Paul Schrader, writer of Scorsese's Taxi Driver, titles his film Hardcore and sets it in the Hollywood sex industry, a world of prostitution, sex trafficking, pornography and snuff movies, you could be forgiven for expecting the ultimate in feverish urban psychosis and graphically depicted violence and sleaze. I mean, that's what you'd anticipate. And when you realise he's going to be exploring the culture clash between the high-concept morality of puritanical religious doctrine and the gratuitous amorality of money-grubbing human depravity and perversion, you know, Little House on the Prairie this ain't. It ain't, right? No, it ain't. But here's the thing. Originally, Warren Beatty was up for the role of the Calvinist father navigating the fleshpots of LA in search of his missing daughter. The girl has apparently been coerced into a life of hardcore porno movies and live sex shows. Only Beatty didn't want to play a parent. He felt he was too young to be the father of a teenage girl. He was 42 at the time. Or let's put it another way. He felt his image as a youthful, swinging, hip Hollywood Lothario was too young. Too with it to be associated with a stuffy old religious dad type. He felt it should be the character's girlfriend who went missing, a very young girlfriend one suspects, which would have fucked riotously with the dynamic of Schrader's script and story. So Schrader said no. Additionally, Beatty didn't want Schrader to direct. So Schrader said no, he was going to direct. So Beatty said no, and pissed off back to his bachelor fuckpad to phone up some willing squeeze and inquire what's new, pussycat, for the billionth time in his life. A far better pastime for him than stinking up Schrader's movie. A good thing, because Schrader then pursued and engaged one of America's greatest screen actors, George C. Scott, and in so doing gave a tremendous boost to the overall quality of the film, because Scott is bloody excellent in it, whereas Beatty would have been absolutely fucking dreadful. Scott plays Jake Van Dorn, a well-off businessman living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A single parent bringing up his teenage daughter, Kristen La Davis, since his wife skipped some years ago. He's a conservative type with strong Calvinist convictions. A bit overprotective of his daughter, he lightens up enough to agree to her going on a church-sponsored trip to a retreat in Bellflower, California. Once there, she goes missing without a trace, and no one can shed any light on her disappearance. He travels to LA and finds the fuzz are next to useless, to the point they advise he employ a private investigator to do their job for them. This one comes in the form of Andy Mast, Peter Boyle, a blunt and quirky guy who offends Jake almost immediately with his salty language. He insists he can find Kristen and sends Jake home whilst he gets on with it. Some months later, Andy turns up in Grand Rapids and takes Jake to an adult film theatre he's booked for a private screening. He runs an 8mm hardcore porno flick. It features Jake's daughter having sex with two young men. Jake is devastated, racked with anguish and despair. Mast insists it was the best way to convince him, rather than just ringing him up and telling him something over the phone he would scarcely believe. Although the origin of the reel is untraceable, Andy insists he can find Kristen and returns to LA. Impatient and distraught, Jake decides to follow him. When he finds the private dick exercising his personal dick with a young hooker on his dime, rejecting the PI's hollow claim it was for research purposes, yeah, likely story, he fires him and sets out to find Kristen under his own steam. Trawling sex emporiums and slot joints with a photo of Kristen, getting the same disinterested and evasive responses, Jake loses patience and kicks off in a brothel, from which he is forcibly ejected. Demoralized and despondent, he decides to modify his approach. Masquerading as a porno movie producer, he takes out an ad in the LA Free Press, casting for male performers for a skin flick. Almost giving up hope of finding any leads, sickened by all the fake auditions he sat through, one of the young men who appeared in the porno with Kristen turns up. When quizzed, Jism Jim, Will Walker, is abusive and insulting about his daughter, so Jake loses it and beats the living shit out of him. Fearful and bleeding, Jim directs Jake to prostitute and porn actress Nikki Season Hubley, who he claims may know where Kristen is. Jake meets up with Nikki at the sordid peep show brothel where she's currently employed. Meanwhile, Jake's brother-in-law Wes, Dick Sargent, worried for Jake's safety and disturbed by his behaviour after tracking him down in LA, re-employs Mast to do whatever he can to maintain Jake's well-being. Nikki believes Kristen has fallen in with a pornographic procurer and dealer called Todd Gary Graham, and may be in San Diego making a sex movie. Jake pays pays Nicky to accompany him and the two set off. Events take a darker turn when Jake learns that Kristin may have become involved with not just Todd but his partner Rattan, Mark Alamo, a notorious figure who makes genuine snuff films. The men are currently located in San Francisco, so Jake and Nicky head there with Jake fearing the worst. Jake persuades Todd to allow him access to a screening of one of Rattan's films, his latest blockbuster made in Mexico. The film depicts Rattan knifing a male actor to death and then slashing the throat of a female participant. When her mask is removed, Jake is relieved to see it isn't Kristin, but is utterly sickened and repulsed by what he's just witnessed. Events are now locked on a collision course involving Jake, Todd, Rattan, Mast and Kristin as the film builds to a climactic conclusion. Perhaps for Paul Schrader, this was a more personal tale than Taxi Driver, The Yakuza or Rolling Thunder, and maybe that's why he was so insistent on both writing and directing. For his first rodeo in the director's chair, he does a decent job, not half bad. He certainly learned how not to royally fuck it up, but Scorsese, he ain't. And it's this sort of super edgy urban fable that really needs that more assured stylistic touch to make it sing and infuse the fizzing neon sleaze with something poetic and emotionally electrifying. Schrader grew up in a Calvinist environment in Grand Rapids, but if you're expecting him to be judgmental about it, he isn't. He's very understanding. Neither is he judgmental of the pornographic counterculture for the most part, until adverse elements of forced exploitation, violence and snuff flicks intrude Hydra-like into the narrative. The bad guys are really bad. Todd is a reptilian sneering henchman to Rattan, who is one evil SOB. But even pornographers can run legitimate businesses and treat their employees with some decency, like Bill Ramada, Leonard Gaines, who may be a porn baron out to make money but isn't sadistic, cruel or villainous. He's a wheeler-dealer businessman who just happens to be in the sex industry. George C. Scott, who didn't rate Schrader as a director and apparently asked him to promise never to direct a film again, is as good as he's ever been. His Jake is adrift in a world he barely sensed existed. He's been so terminally closed off and cloistered in religious dogma. He is appalled and maybe just a little fascinated by this perverse subculture that feeds on the basest instincts of human beings. Out of his depth, he quickly picks up the pace, but never once does Scott let slip the impression of just how revolted and disgusted he is by it all. It is the antithesis of everything he believes in and holds dear, an open sewer he forces himself to swim in to get his child back. And you've got to respect him for that. Scott teems with barely suppressed repugnance and rage, and, yes, at least some compassion and decency. Without him, the film would have sunk by at least 50% in my estimation. The support he gets is first rate, immaculate. Peter Boyle played a lot of knowing characters on screen. Dylan in The Friends of Eddie Coyle, Wizard in Taxi Driver, and Andy Mast in Hardcore. All those characters knew stuff and knew what they were about. They knew the score. Andy's clued in, just his personal frailties don't exactly inspire trust or faith, and his intentions can be misinterpreted, which makes for a prickly dynamic between him and Jake. After the theatre screening in Grand Rapids, he confidently insists to Jake that he will get Kristin back, but he warns what she'll be like by then may mean Jake won't want her back. Jake doesn't trust in a single word of it. Still, it's a nice little nod from Schrader to Ford's The Searchers, and I for one believed in Boyle's sincerity. Diana Scarwid was originally cast by Schrader in the role of Nikki, but the studio felt she wasn't attractive enough. I know, go figure. They insisted on Season Hubley instead, and although Miss Hubley is very capable and captivating, from the neck down she looks like someone has managed to breathe life into an ironing board. I'm not objectifying her, honestly, just observing that she has no striking physical feminine attributes at this time in her life. But then maybe the point is that she's a sex worker, and men looking for sex from a sex worker just don't care about such aesthetics. I think they probably do in a way, but what do I fucking know? Anyway, I've dug that hole now, so I guess I'll lie in it and pull the dirt in on top of me. See if I can dig myself out a bit. Season Hubley delivers a career best performance as Nikki. She hits all the right notes of sass, cynicism and vulgar sexuality, underscored with just the right hints of vulnerability and need. Later, she tries to withhold information from Jake because she fears that if he gets Kristin back, he will abandon her. That's how fragile and desperate to attach she really is. He promises her he won't forsake her, but you know men and their promises. Despite being polar opposites, Nikki relates to him because he's something she's not experienced before in life. A man completely disinterested in physically exploiting, abusing, or using her for sex. She suggests they're not so different. She doesn't care about sex either. For Jake, the primary function is procreation. For her, it's a financial transaction. Neither of them sees it as a means of pleasure, satisfaction, or making human contact. Naturally enough, Jake disagrees. It's two different things. They're two different people. But maybe on some level, Nikki has a point. Schrader cast Lara Davis as Kristen because she was not conventionally beautiful or traditionally sexually attractive. Perhaps then more likely to be the sort of young girl who would respond eagerly to flattering male overtures. I thought she looked quite doe-eyed and fetching, to be honest, in an angular, borderline anorexic sort of way, bulimic chic, and her casting worked well. It's clear early on at the Christmas gathering in Grand Rapids something is troubling her. Schrader zones in on her for brief instants. Her expressions suggesting distraction, giving the impression that she's preoccupied, haunted, a prelude to subsequent events. When I first saw it in the old Market Hall, it had been renamed The Hardcore Life for its UK release. What a dumb, stupid fucking title. I'm guessing this may have been to avoid confusion with the Fiona Richmond softcore Brit porno called Hardcore, released in 1977. Or maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe the UK distributors thought it sounded like something you put in the foundations of a patio. Anyway, other favourable stuff includes the writing being good, a great Jack Nietzsche score blasting a lovely discomforting blend of church organs and squealing rock guitars, whilst Michael Chapman's cinematography draws effectively on his work on Taxi Driver to provide some great fluid nocturnal visuals with some stellar lighting effects. Thematically, as well as focusing on religious conflict and alienation, Schrader is quick to affirm that philosophical musings on fighting monsters and becoming the thing we hate have merit in truth. Jake metaphorically descends into hell on his quest, partially sacrifices his morality to get where he needs to go, tests his faith to the limits. He cannot shield himself fully against the corrosive taint of sex and violence. He can resist the temptation of sex. His doctrine has conditioned him too fully to entertain wavering, but the utility of violence to further his aims becomes unavoidable. A last resort, but an inescapable one. If this were Eastwood, Bronson, or even Travis Bickle, the payoff would have been one of blazing magnums and a bullet-riddled bloodbath. Okay, so Rattan does get shot, but it's Andy Mass does the shooting. Jake gets physically violent, beating up some punks in a very satisfying way, and even slapping and threatening Nikki once when she withholds information, but he never touches a firearm. For him, it doesn't end the way of the gun. How it does end is with the twist we have suspected all along. Kristen is a willing participant. She hasn't been abducted and held against her will, believing her father does not love her, suffocated by the repression of Calvinism, trapped in a straitjacket of rigid religious doctrine. She's a classic runaway case, one that ran away into the squalid, welcoming arms of prostitution and pornography, wherein she imagines the exploiters and the pornographers truly love and value her, which is of course absurd. It's an illusion they peddle merely to procure her compliance. But when people are desperate to be loved and valued, especially when they are young and naive and denied access to and knowledge of a world outside of their restricted existence, an illusion can seem an attractive alternative to nothing. Only when Jake breaks down, spiritually fractures, collapses and weeps in front of her, and she can see just what he's gone through to reach her, to get her back, Kristen has a sudden change of heart. Suddenly, she's going home with Daddy, and all will be well. This is the moment where the show tips over into schmaltz-drenched melodrama and surrenders to theatrical contrivance. It ends as Little House on the Prairie. Jake, an honest and upright ramrod from a strict religious community, a man of principle and fortitude, abandons his promise to Nikki in an instant, turns away from her, suggests to Andy maybe he could give him some money to give to her to help her out, pay her off for services rendered, you know? Andy smiles wryly, knowingly, and advises,
Go home, Governor. There's nothing you can do. You don't belong here.
Go home, you don't belong here. So that's what he does. Now, I don't have anything against happy endings, but this one doesn't work contextually with the film we've just seen. Was it at the insistence of the studio, I wonder? Maybe they demanded a positive outcome for Jake and Kristen. I don't know. But for me, it just doesn't track right. It's too clean, too neat, too, well, phew, that was a nightmare. Now it's over, and they all lived happily ever after. Yeah, what? John Milius, who produced, reckoned in the original script Jake never found his daughter. After his encounter with Todd and Ratani hit a dead end. Kristen had gone. Some years later, he learns of her death in a car crash. I could live with that. What do you mean, nihilistic twat? How unkind. Apart from the ending being, well, soapy and mawkish, I think Schrader had another major problem. If you're going to make a film called Hardcore and it's going to be set in the world of hardcore pornography, to create it authentically, it would have to be hardcore pornography itself. An uncertifiable piece of exploitation that no commercial distributor would touch. And Schrader was making a piece of commercial cinema, which restricts what you can show and depict and how you can show and depict it. You can only be explicit and gratuitous up to a certain point. Having someone like George C. Scott headlining helps a lot. In a scene like, oh, say this one, the audience must imagine what he's seeing, and it's the look on his face, his body language, his reactions that are critical in communicating those images. Scott was a master of expression and emotional projection. The scene in the movie theatre is another case in point. We don't see what he's seeing, what's happening between Kristen and the two men, but his explosion of anguish, chronic despair, revulsion and disgust paints the pictures for us from his perspective. Gotta admit, for an instant there, I thought it would topple into absurd melodramatic parody, but Scott is skilled enough to take it to the very edge and no further. In many respects, he's the making of this film. It was lucky to have him. Worth a look then? For many reasons, yes it is. It's a good solid film with complex, well-drawn, well-acted characters and a rich and compelling narrative driving it along. Only don't expect it to live up to the title, because it's very much a case of hardcore by name, softcore at heart. Thank you most sincerely for your gracious time and attention. Please feel free to do whatever you choose to do next. Hit like, don't like, comment, subscribe, check out my early access Patreon thing, or even make a welcome financial contribution via the thanks button. Up next is whatever takes my fancy, I suppose. So much to choose from, so little time. Ah well, no matter. Let's crack on. Soon, pilgrims.